So for a while now, I've been saying that we're going to improve our error handling, and that's what I want to take care of in this section. So if you'll recall, a long time ago, when we set up the app config, I put in this line, infolog, and I said, we're not doing anything with it right now, but we'll deal with that or it'll be useful when we actually start our error handling, our improved error handling. And this is the case right now. So at the moment, we have use cache, template cache, infolog, in production, and session set in our app config. And I'm going to add another one. And I'm going to call it error log. And what we're going to do is have two things available to us in our application configuration that allow us to write logs and handle errors more efficiently. So I've set up another one. So now I have infolog, which is a pointer to log.logger, and error log, which is also a pointer to log.logger. And log.logger is something built into the application, into Go's standard library. So now let's go back to our main function and do something with those. So in my main function, under my run part, right after I declare my app in production is equal to false, I'm going to set up right here. And it can be anywhere in this, but I'm going to put it right at the top of my run, just after the app in production is set to false. And I'm going to set up some loggers. So let's create a logger. Let's create one called infolog. And that is going to be equal to, I'll have to declare it in a moment, but I'll do that in a moment. That is going to be equal to log, which is a standard package built right into the standard library. New, I'm creating a new logger. And it's going to write. Where does it write? It writes, well, I just want the infolog right now to print to the terminal. So I'll just say, print it to OS standard out, which again is built right into the standard library. And that is our terminal window. That's where it's going to print it. So we're going to print it there. And then the second argument is, do you want to prefix this log with anything? And I do. I want to prefix it with the word info, so I know that it's an information. And then I'll just put a tab after it, which the /t just says, write the word info and then put a tab, a bunch of blank spaces after that. And then what do I want to write in there? At the end of it, we have the flag, something that we can actually append to it or deal with it. I'll put in the log ldate, which is a date in a nice readable format. And then I'll put a pipe, and I'll say log.ltime. And this allows me to use this infolog variable, which I should declare. So let's do that right now. We'll just say var infolog is of type *log.logger, and I'll do the error log too, because we're going to be using that in a moment. Error log. So I've created my infolog here. Now I can make that part of my app-wide variable. app.infolog is equal to infolog. I could have done this on one line and just said app.infolog is equal to all of this, but I think this is more readable. Now let's set up an error log. And I want an error log. When I go to final version of this, I want to write it to a file, but I'm not going to worry about that right now. I'll just make the error log also write to the terminal, which is useful for development purposes because I don't have to keep opening an external file to see if there are any errors or to read an error. So we'll make error log equal to log.new. And where do I want it to write? Right now I want it to write to OS standard out. And I want to prefix that with error and a tab. And what do I want to write to it? Well, I want to write something a little bit more sophisticated to the error log, okay? So I'll make it write to, I'll have the log.ldate, same as before, and then a pipe, and then log.ltime, same as before, but then I'll put at the end of that a little bit more information, log.l short file, which will actually give me information about the error. And now that I've created that, I can actually put that in my site-wide config. Error log is equal to error log. Now, the fact that I've done that, the fact that I've created those two things means it's available to me anywhere I want to use it. And there's lots of places I probably want to use it. I could go back and just every time I want to write an error message, instead of going log.println or format.println, I could use my error log or my info log. But I want to be a little more sophisticated about this. So what I'm going to do now is create a new package. I'm going to go back to internal because it's an internal package, only useful to us in this application. I'll create a new directory and I'll call that helpers. And here's where I'm going to put things that are useful that I can use in various parts of my application and just call them by calling the helpers package. So let's create a new file in that, a new Go file, which I'll just call helpers, helpers.go, and I will add it to the repository. So what am I going to put in this helpers file? Well, to start with, one of the things I want to have access to in the helpers file is my site-wide config. So I'll create a new variable called app, and that's going to be a pointer to config.appconfig. So I have that variable declared, but I need some method of actually populating it with the site-wide config. So I'll create a new function, func new helpers, and that will take one argument right now, a star.appconfig.appconfig. So it takes, we're going to pass this function, our application, and we're not going to return anything. And all we'll do is set app equal to a. So when I call this, which I'm going to do right now, when I call this function, say from our main.go, where I'm doing it everywhere else, I can do this, duplicate that, and make this helpers, new helpers. When I call it now, when this application is set up, this run function is called, it will actually populate that variable app in helpers with a pointer to appconfig. So now I have access to it. And I should give this a comment. Sets up app config for helpers. All right, now what do I want to have in this helpers function? Well, what I'm trying to do in this section of the course is deal with errors. And if you think about it logically, there are two kinds of errors that we can have on a regular basis. We can have client errors, where the client did something wrong, or we can have server errors, where, despite our best efforts, something went wrong with the server. So our code threw an error. Maybe it panicked and then recovered from it, whatever it may be. But what I effectively have are two kinds of errors. Func client error, and that's going to have to take some parameters. And what am I going to pass it? Well, when you have a client error, one of the things that's really useful is to have the response writer. So let's assume we're going to pass it the response writer, http.response-writer, because we might need to write something to the client. And then when they gave the error, we will have a status. We'll know what kind of error that was, whatever it may be, a bad request, a 400 or a 403, whatever. But you're going to get a status, and that'll be in the form of an int. And this won't return anything. So I'm going to leave that empty for right now, and I'll create the second useful function, func server error. Something went wrong with the server. And for here, in this case, I'm still going to want the response writer, because I'm going to have to write some kind of response to the client. But rather than the status, in this point, we're going to have an error. I know I'm going to have an error when I do that. An error is of type error. So there are my two functions. Let's deal with the first one first, the client error. And what am I going to do here? Well, what I'm going to do right now is throw an http.error. Because it's a client error, I need to give them some kind of response. And built into the standard library, we have http.error. So I'll use an error. And it takes two arguments. It takes a response writer, which I have, because I'm taking that as one of the parameters for this. And it also has an error string. Well, I don't know what that is. Yeah, I actually do. I now have the status. That's easy. The third one is a status, so I know I can pass the status. But I can actually, again, use the built-in functionality of the standard library to say http.statusText and then pass it the status. And the last thing is the int. What kind of status am I going to be returning? Well, I already have that. I'm passing it as an argument, status. So there is one thing I can do, a client error. But I can also, if I want to, write to the error log or write to the info log. So what do I want to do here? Let's just say we're going to write to the info log, just for the sake of argument. I can now, because I have that application-wide config, I can say app.infolog.println, and then I can put whatever I want in here. So what am I going to put in here? I can say client error with status of, and then pass the status. So now I can actually write to a log file. And that's not terribly useful, but that's just demonstrating that we now have access to this info log. In the same way, if we actually have an error, I want as much information as I can possibly get about that error. So one of the things I can do is actually get a trace of the error using some of the functionality built into the standard library. So I'm going to create a variable called trace, which is going to trace the nature of the error, and that will hold a string. And that string is going to be built up using our FUMPT format package, fmt.sprintf. And inside of that, I'm going to put in a string that consists of a series of placeholders. The first one will be a string, and we'll populate that in a moment. The second one will be /n, which gives me a new line. Like /t writes a tab, /n writes a new line. And then I'm going to put another string. And so I have two placeholders to replace. The first one will be the nature of the error itself. Well, I have that because I've passed it as a parameter right here. So I can go error, error, which will print the error message as a string. And then I want the actual stack trace, the detailed information about the nature of the error that took place. And I can get that from debug, which is built right into the standard library. And the method or the function I want to call on that is stack. All right, so now I've got this trace string, this variable trace, that consists of the error message and then a new line, and then the stack trace associated with the error message. And that's really useful information when you're trying to figure out what went wrong. You need that information. So we can save this. Right now, our error log, which we're going to use in a moment, just writes it to the standard out to the terminal. But when we go into production, we can have our error log write to a file and actually put a directive in here that might send a text or send an email. It can let someone know that something went wrong, and then they can go open the log file and look at the error message and go fix the problem. But for right now, let's just write this error log to the window. app.errorlog.println, and I'll write my trace. And then I need to give some kind of feedback to the user, which is why I'm actually having this response writer here. So let's again call http.error, http.error, and it wants a response writer, which I have. We want the status text. In this case, the status text is internal server error, but I'm going to be, absolutely technically correct and use the http.statustext function. And what I'll pass it is the code for an internal server error, which is http.statusInternalServerError, right there. And then I need the last part for my third parameter to call error is, again, the code. And it's http.statusInternalServerError. And that will do it. Now I have two functions available to me, two helper functions, where I can actually print or handle an error in a useful fashion. So I've created this helpers package. I haven't done anything with it except to initialize the application config from main.go. In the next lecture, we'll go put this in a few places where we can centralize our error handling.